late 1970s. Across America, a familiar purple bottle quietly vanished from grocery store shelves. There was no dramatic announcement, no massive bankruptcy headline. Grapette, the grape soda that defined an entire generation's childhood, simply ceased to exist. At its peak, this small-town Arkansas creation was an absolute juggernaut, selling over 1 billion bottles annually. It was a national sensation that stood toe-to-toe with industry giants. Yet within a few short years of corporate buyouts, the original formula was altered, the sprawling bottling network was dismantled, and a multi-million-dollar empire evaporated into absolute zero. How does a cultural phenomenon that's sold by the billions just vanish into thin air? And by what impossible miracle does the nostalgic memory of a single billionaire, Walmart founder Sam Walton, drag a dead brand back from the grave decades later? From a humble lab in Camden, Arkansas, to the relentless shelves of Walmart. This is a story of corporate greed, the silent erasure of an American icon, and the eternal power of a childhood memory. The year is 1939. The American South is still steadily pulling itself out from the suffocating dust, widespread poverty, and profound economic ruin of the Great Depression. In the quiet lumber and rail town of Camden, Arkansas, the air is thick with the heavy humidity of the Wachita River Valley. Here, far removed from the towering corporate boardrooms of New York or the massive industrialized syrup factories of Atlanta, a different kind of American enterprise is quietly taking shape. It is an empire not built on steel, coal, or automobiles. It is built on water, sugar, and an elusive, exhaustive pursuit of flavor. At the center of this pursuit is Benjamin Tyndall Fuchs, known locally as B.T. Fuchs. He is a man of modest means but unyielding persistence. Years earlier, in 1928, Fuchs had purchased a struggling local bottling plant. While the emerging giants of the soft drink world, Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, are busy fighting a bitter, high-stakes national war for cola supremacy, independent regional bottlers like Fuchs survive by operating entirely on the margins. They sustain their small businesses by selling localized fruit sodas to rural communities. But Fuchs is not satisfied with merely surviving the economic turbulence of the era. He possesses a specific consuming ambition. He does not want to compete with the cola empires on their own battleground. He wants to conquer a territory they have largely ignored, or worse, fundamentally failed to master. He wants to create the perfect grape soda. In the late 1930s, the very concept of a mass-market grape-flavored beverage is highly problematic. The soft drink industry has managed to replicate oranges, lemons, and strawberries with reasonable commercial success. Grape, however, remains the great white whale of flavor chemistry. For decades, attempts by various companies to bottle the essence of the grape have resulted in dismal, unpalatable failures. The available formulas invariably taste harsh, synthetic, and aggressively chemical. To the American consumer, the existing grape sodas on the market do not taste like fruit. They taste like medicine. They carry the heavy, syrupy profile of cheap cough remedies, leaving a cloying, artificial aftertaste that repels rather than refreshes the drinker. This deep-seated public association with medicine serves as a massive psychological barrier. Major bottlers have largely abandoned the flavor, writing it off as a commercial dead end. But Fuchs views this industry-wide failure not as a warning sign, but as an unguarded, highly lucrative frontier. He understands a fundamental truth of consumer psychology. If a bottler can successfully capture the genuine, light, and refreshing taste of real conquered grapes without the medicinal baggage, they will own an entirely undisputed segment of the market. The public demand for authenticity is immense. The supply is virtually non-existent. The pursuit of this elusive formula becomes Fuchs's singular obsession. Inside his modest Camden facility, the bottling plant transforms into a makeshift alchemy lab. He procures dozens of different grape extracts, synthetic compounds, and natural fruit oils from flavor houses across the entire country. Day after day, month after month, he engages in a methodical, financially punishing process of trial and error. He mixes experimental batches in small glass vials. He carefully adjusts the acidity, tweaking the delicate balance of citric and tartaric acids to cut through the heavy sugar base, attempting to mimic the natural, sharp bite of a real grape skin. He alters the carbonation levels, seeking the precise amount of fizz required to lift the flavor profile off the palate, rather than letting it sit heavily on the tongue. Most attempts are immediate failures. The experimental mixtures separate in the bottles, the colors turn muddy and unappealing, or the taste inevitably veers right back into that dreaded cough syrup territory. Yet Fuchs does not compromise. He relies on a highly localized and brutally honest testing group: himself, his plant employees, and the everyday residents of Camden. He enlists Hubert Owen, a trusted associate, pushing him to sample endless, minor variations of the syrup. They taste, they debate, they refine, and they pour gallons of rejected syrup down the factory drains. The financial strain of purchasing expensive raw materials for failed batches weighs heavily on the small Arkansas company, but Fuchs refuses to rush a flawed product to market. The formula has to be immaculate. It cannot simply be good enough for a grape soda. It has to redefine what a fruit beverage can be. Finally, in the early spring of 1939, the rigorous alchemy yields results: a distinct, brilliant purple liquid. Fuchs develops a proprietary blend that achieves the impossible. By meticulously combining specific, tightly guarded proportions of distinct grape flavorings, he manages to completely neutralize the harsh chemical notes that had plagued the industry for decades. The resulting liquid is a revelation. It is bright, crisp, and carries the authentic, sun-ripened sweetness of fresh Concord grapes. The heavy, medicinal aftertaste is entirely gone, replaced by a clean, sharp finish. When he tests this finalized formulation on the people of Camden, the reaction is instantaneous and overwhelmingly positive. People do not just tolerate the new drink, they are captivated by it. It is a flavor profile that American consumers have never experienced in a carbonated beverage. Fuchs knows immediately that he has struck a vein of pure commercial gold. He names the creation Grapette. The name itself is soft, approachable, and intentionally lacks the aggressive, industrial branding of many contemporary products. But having the perfect liquid in a vat in Arkansas is only the first part of the equation. To transform a local triumph into a sprawling national empire, B.T. Fuchs knows he must completely rethink how the product is packaged, delivered, and consumed. He is about to make a series of highly unconventional decisions that will defy industry standards, infuriate traditional bottlers, and ultimately catapult his purple creation into the homes of millions of Americans. The foundation is poured. The true machinery of the Grapette empire is about to be switched on. By early 1940, the perfect syrup sat in stainless steel vats in Camden, Arkansas. But a flawless liquid is not a business. It is merely an ingredient. To transform Grapette from a local curiosity into a national commodity, B.T. Fuchs had to confront the brutal, unyielding mechanics of industrial packaging and mass distribution. In the fiercely competitive soft drink market of the mid-20th century, the vessel holding the beverage was just as critical to survival as the beverage itself. At the time, the beverage industry was locked in an escalating volume war. Brands like Pepsi-Cola were aggressively marketing heavy, 12-ounce bottles for a single nickel, actively training the American consumer to equate economic value with sheer physical quantity. The conventional wisdom of the era dictated that to survive, a regional manufacturer had to offer as much liquid as possible for the lowest possible price. Fuchs, however, made a calculated and highly risky decision to do the exact opposite. He introduced Grapette in a distinct, lightweight 6-ounce clear glass bottle. To the established beverage distributors of the era, this strategy bordered on commercial suicide. Selling half the volume of competitors for the same 5-cent price point seemed like a guaranteed failure in a consumer market still heavily scarred by the frugal habits of the Great Depression. But Fuchs understood something crucial about the product he had engineered. Grapette was not designed to be a bulk commodity. It was formulated to be a premium, highly concentrated sensory experience. The clear glass was a deliberate, vital choice of marketing through industrial design. Most root beers, colas, and ginger ales hid behind thick brown or dark green glass to mask the murky, visually unappealing color of their raw syrups. Grapette had nothing to hide. The transparent, elegantly ribbed 6-ounce bottle functioned as a display case, showcasing the beverage's brilliant, jewel-toned purple hue. In the standard retail environment of the 1940s, where sodas were pulled from deep, water-filled metal ice coolers at gas stations and grocery stores, the vivid purple color caught the light, acting as its own silent, inescapable billboard beneath the freezing water. Furthermore, the smaller volume served a strict functional purpose regarding the chemistry of the drink. Fuchs had formulated the syrup to be exceptionally dense in flavor. He intended for Grapette to be served ice-cold without ice, chilled rapidly in those water bath coolers, and consumed directly from the glass neck. Pouring the soda over ice in a separate glass would melt and dilute the meticulously balanced tartness and sweetness that he had spent years agonizing over. The compact 6-ounce size ensured the drink remained sharply carbonated and perfectly chilled from the first sip to the last, preventing it from turning flat or warm in the summer heat. It was a business strategy built entirely on intensity rather than volume. The gamble was massive. Fuchs was betting everything on the assumption that the American public would happily pay a premium price for exceptional, undiluted quality. The gamble paid off with staggering, violent speed. When the small, ribbed bottles hit the market, the consumer response bypassed mere popularity and instantly shifted into a cultural phenomenon. Buyers did not care about the diminished volume. They were captivated by the striking visual presentation and the unprecedented, clean fruit flavor that delivered exactly what it promised. Demand immediately and violently outstripped the production capacity of the small Camden facility. To scale his operation from a regional success to a national powerhouse, Fuchs implemented a sprawling, aggressive franchise bottling system. Rather than attempting to secure the massive capital required to build and manage distant factories himself, he sold the exclusive rights to bottle and distribute Grapette to independent industrial operators across the country. He shipped the proprietary concentrated syrup out of Arkansas by rail and heavy truck in massive steel drums, allowing local entrepreneurs to add the carbonated water, bottle the final product on their own assembly lines, and distribute it within their rigidly defined territories. This decentralized industrial network allowed the brand to expand at a blistering, almost uncontrollable pace. B.T. Fuchs traveled relentlessly, crisscrossing the United States by train and automobile to pitch his purple gold to eager investors. These independent bottlers became the vital, pumping arteries of the Grapette empire. They were the ones loading heavy wooden crates onto delivery trucks at dawn, pushing the product into small-town pharmacies, roadside service stations, and crowded urban diners. Camden itself was transformed by the sheer volume of production, becoming a bustling hub of syrup manufacturing, pumping out millions of gallons to feed the insatiable national network. The physical expansion was fueled by a ubiquitous and highly effective psychological marketing campaign. Tin signs, thermometers, and roadside billboards plastered the American landscape with a simple, supremely confident slogan, "Thirsty or not." It was a masterstroke of consumer conditioning. It positioned the soda not merely as a functional remedy for dehydration, but as an affordable, everyday luxury. The messaging implied that you didn't need a physical reason to buy a Grapette. The flavor alone justified the purchase at any hour of the day. By the end of World War II, as sugar rationing finally lifted and the post-war economic boom roared to life, Grapette reached a dizzying industrial peak. Over 600 independent bottling plants across the United States were churning out the 6-ounce bottles, their automated assembly lines clinking endlessly with the sound of glass. Annual sales figures skyrocketed into the tens of millions, eventually crossing the astonishing billion-bottle mark globally. Grapette had become the undisputed king of fruit-flavored sodas, holding a market position that seemed as solid and permanent as the steel vats in Camden. Yet, embedded deep within the architecture of this massive success was a fatal structural vulnerability. The entire empire relied on a fragile ecosystem of independent localized bottlers. Grapette owned the secret syrup and the brand name, but they did not own the final miles of delivery or the bottling machinery itself. As the 1950s approached, the landscape of American commerce was preparing to undergo a ruthless, predatory consolidation. The towering titans of the beverage industry were awakening, and they were preparing to weaponize the very independent bottling networks that Fuchs had relied upon to build his kingdom. The golden era of the independent soda baron was quietly drawing to a close. The golden era of American manufacturing immediately following World War II was a period of explosive, unrestrained prosperity, but it also masked a rapidly approaching era of ruthless corporate consolidation. As the 1950s unfolded, the fundamental architecture of American commerce began to mutate, shifting economic power away from regional innovators and delivering it firmly into the hands of centralized mega-corporations. For B.T. Fuchs and his thriving Grapette headquarters in Camden, Arkansas, the initial post-war years felt like an endless, highly profitable victory lap. Millions of the distinct 6-ounce ribbed glass bottles were moving effortlessly through a sprawling, decentralized network of over 600 independent bottling plants. Grapette had successfully carved out a massive niche, entirely dominating the fruit-flavored beverage market and securing its place in the daily rituals of the American public. But success of that magnitude in a purely capitalist ecosystem never goes unnoticed. It inevitably draws the cold, calculating gaze of apex predators. While Fuchs had spent the 1930s and 40s obsessively perfecting flavor chemistry and building a grassroots distribution network, the undisputed titans of the soft drink industry, most notably Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola, had been busy amassing colossal reserves of capital and establishing unassailable national supply chains. For decades, these industry giants had focused their immense resources almost exclusively on their bitter, high-stakes war for cola supremacy. Regional fruit sodas were largely viewed as a secondary, highly localized battleground, seemingly not worth the logistical effort of a massive, synchronized national campaign. However, the cultural landscape of the 1950s completely changed the rules of engagement. The rapid proliferation of television sets transformed American marketing, allowing massive corporations to blast homogenized, high-production advertising directly into millions of living rooms simultaneously. At the same time, the rise of the modern, brightly lit supermarket began replacing the small, independent neighborhood grocery store, fundamentally altering how American families purchased their goods. Retail space was no longer about pulling a single cold bottle from a metal cooler. It was about dominating massive aisles with bulk cardboard cartons. The cola empires quickly realized that with their newfound marketing reach and deeply established infrastructure, they could conquer the entire beverage aisle, not just the cola segment. They were no longer satisfied with mere market dominance. They demanded total market saturation. The corporate giants officially awakened, and they immediately identified the decentralized, independent bottling network the exact fragile foundation upon which the Grapette empire was built, as their primary target for structural demolition. The subsequent corporate assault was not a direct attack on Grapette's proprietary syrup or its legendary flavor profile. It was a cold, highly calculated, infrastructural siege. The major cola corporations understood a fundamental reality of the beverage industry. Whoever controls the physical bottling facilities and the delivery trucks controls the entire market. They began deploying a strategy of aggressive territorial expansion, combined with predatory exclusivity contracts. Armed with bottomless marketing budgets and undeniable culturally pervasive brand power, executives from the giants began approaching the independent family-owned bottling plants that comprised Fuchs' sprawling national network. They offered these local operators highly lucrative, high-volume franchise agreements that promised immense, long-term financial stability. But these golden contracts came with a brutal, non-negotiable ultimatum: total exclusivity. If a local bottler wanted the financial security, the massive volume, and the prestige of producing Coca-Cola or Pepsi, they were strictly prohibited from bottling any competing products. Furthermore, to ensure there was no gap in the market, the giants began rolling out their own lines of aggressively marketed, secondary fruit-flavored sodas. The independent operators, many of whom had built their businesses and their family livelihoods alongside Grapette, were suddenly forced into an agonizing, existential financial corner. The mathematics of this new corporate era were entirely unforgiving. While Grapette offered an undeniably superior premium product with fierce localized consumer loyalty, it simply could not match the sheer, overwhelming volume, the heavy profit margins, and the inescapable national advertising muscle of the cola conglomerates. Back in Camden, the telegraph lines and telephones began to deliver a steady, escalating stream of bad news. One by one, the vital, pumping arteries of the Grapette network began to sever. Independent bottlers across the country reluctantly, and often painfully, dropped their contracts with the Camden factory in order to secure their survival under the heavy umbrella of the mega corporations. Other independent bottlers, proudly refusing to submit to the monopolies, simply went bankrupt, unable to compete with the aggressively scaled, heavily subsidized distribution networks of the giants. B.T. Fuchs watched helplessly as his meticulously constructed empire of independent operators was systematically dismantled by macroeconomic forces far larger than flavor, quality, or local loyalty. The beautiful 6-ounce glass bottle, once a symbol of premium perfection and a unique competitive advantage, suddenly became a crippling liability in a retail market newly obsessed with bulk volume and corporate homogenization. The invisible structural walls of the American economy were rapidly closing in on the small town of Camden, and the mounting, suffocating pressure was forcing the proud, independent company toward a desperate and ultimately fatal corporate pivot. By the time the calendar turned to 1969, the American economic landscape had become entirely unrecognizable to the men who had built it just 3 decades earlier. The post-war era of the localized independent manufacturer, a time when a determined inventor in a small town could carve out a massive slice of the national market, was rapidly and violently drawing to a close. The country was now increasingly ruled by conglomerates. Massive, heavily consolidated megacorporations were systematically swallowing up regional businesses, driven by a Wall Street culture that prized aggressive diversification and endless quarterly growth above all else. In the humid river valley of Camden, Arkansas, B.T. Fuchs was acutely aware of this shifting tide. He was no longer the hungry, relentless upstart who had spent countless agonizing nights pouring failed, medicinal-tasting syrups down the factory drains. He was now an aging executive, weary from fighting a continuous, exhausting war of attrition against industry titans. He had watched with a heavy heart as his meticulously constructed network of independent franchise bottlers was slowly dismantled by the predatory exclusivity contracts of the corporate giants. Fuchs had held the line for 30 years, fiercely protecting his proprietary formula and his brand's independence. But the suffocating pressure of a consolidating market left him cornered. The immense capital required to modernize, advertise, and compete on a truly national scale in the approaching 1970s was simply beyond the reach of a standalone Arkansas operation. Facing the grim, unavoidable mathematics of modern commerce, Fuchs made the most difficult decision of his professional life. In 1969, he agreed to sell the Grapette company to the Rheingold Corporation. Rheingold was a towering, New York-based conglomerate, famous primarily for its massive, high-volume brewing operations in the Northeast. Flush with capital, the corporation was aggressively seeking to diversify its holdings beyond beer, attempting to build a sprawling, unified portfolio of beverage properties. They had recently acquired Flavette, another regional soft drink company, and the acquisition of Grapette, a beloved, nationally recognized brand with a billion-bottle legacy, was viewed as the perfect crown jewel for their new, non-alcoholic division. On paper, the acquisition was framed to the public as a vital strategic partnership, a way to inject necessary lifeblood and corporate muscle into a struggling regional treasure. But in reality, it marked a profound and fatal severing of the brand's soul. When the final contracts were signed, the deep, localized heartbeat of Grapette instantly stopped. Control of the famous purple syrup was abruptly uprooted from the close-knit community of Camden. It passed from a passionate founder who intimately understood every chemical nuance of his creation, directly into the hands of a distant board of directors operating out of a sterile, high-altitude boardroom in Manhattan. These new corporate custodians shared no history with the product. They had no personal connection to the town that built it, no reverence for the struggle of its creation, and absolutely zero understanding of the delicate, almost emotional bond the beverage had forged with millions of American consumers. To B.T. Fuchs, Grapette was a triumph of human perseverance. To Rheingold, it was merely an acquired asset, a line item on a ledger waiting to be ruthlessly optimized. The moment Rheingold assumed total operational control, a catastrophic ideological clash began to unfold behind closed doors. The new executive leadership approached their newly acquired Arkansas property with the cold, hyper-industrialized mindset of a high-volume commercial brewery. Their immediate priority was not to understand why people loved Grapette, but rather to deploy aggressive corporate audits to identify and eliminate what they perceived as operational inefficiencies. Unfortunately for the legacy of the drink, nearly every single element that made Grapette unique, premium, and beloved was viewed by Rheingold's accountants as an unacceptable financial burden. The first casualty of this corporate logic was the brand's physical presentation. Rheingold's analysts looked at Grapette's iconic 6-ounce clear glass bottle and were completely baffled. In a beverage market that was rapidly pivoting toward larger, 12-ounce and 16-ounce disposable containers, the corporate executives viewed the small, heavy glass as a logistical nightmare. They did not care about B.T. Fuchs's carefully engineered concept of ice cold without ice. They did not care that the precise 6-ounce volume was meticulously designed to ensure the highly carbonated, sharply flavored syrup was consumed rapidly before it could turn warm and flat in the summer heat. To a company accustomed to shipping millions of gallons of generic beer, a 6-ounce bottle was simply a mechanism that depressed overall sales volume and complicated standardized shipping routes. Furthermore, the corporate auditors turned their attention to the proprietary syrup itself. Fuchs had always demanded the use of premium, highly concentrated, and expensive raw flavor extracts to ensure the sharp, authentic bite of real Concord grapes. Where Fuchs saw an uncompromising commitment to quality that commanded fierce brand loyalty, Rheingold saw an excessively bloated manufacturing expense eating directly into their profit margins. This disconnect revealed a fatal corporate miscalculation, one that has destroyed countless acquired brands throughout industrial history. Rheingold operated under the arrogant assumption that a brand's true value resided entirely in its trademark name and its recognizable logo, entirely divorced from the physical reality of the product itself. The executives believed that consumers bought Grapette purely out of blind habit. They assumed the American public was fundamentally unsophisticated, betting that buyers would happily accept any purple, carbonated liquid as long as it was poured from a bottle bearing the familiar, comforting Grapette script. Armed with this dangerous, detached logic, the New York board began drafting sweeping directives to completely dismantle the foundational architecture of the Arkansas company. They had absolutely no interest in maintaining the expensive, premium ingredients, nor were they willing to navigate the complexities of a unique, specialized bottling process. The orders handed down from corporate headquarters were absolute, prioritizing synergy and aggressive cost-cutting over everything else. The new owners were preparing to fix a product that was structurally perfect. In their blind pursuit of immediate financial optimization, Rheingold was positioning itself to gut the very essence of the beverage, standing on the precipice of one of the most agonizing, self-inflicted commercial disasters in American history. The transition of power from the humid, hands-on environment of Camden, Arkansas, to the sterile, high-altitude boardrooms of New York City triggered a rapid, systematic dismantling of everything that made Grapette a cultural institution. When the Rheingold Corporation took complete operational control in 1969, they did not see a beloved American beverage with a meticulously crafted legacy. They saw a regional asset laden with unacceptable manufacturing overhead. Armed with spreadsheets, quarterly profit targets, and ruthless efficiency mandates, the new executive leadership immediately targeted the very soul of the brand. The proprietary formula B.T. Fuchs had spent agonizing years perfecting. In the beverage industry, the line between a premium product and a generic commodity is defined entirely by the quality of its raw ingredients. Fuchs had always demanded the use of expensive, high-grade fruit oils and a tightly controlled balance of natural acids to ensure the sharp, authentic bite of real Concord grapes. To the corporate auditors at Rheingold, this uncompromising commitment to quality was viewed as a massive, unnecessary financial drain. The mandate from headquarters was clear and unforgiving. Lower the production costs immediately by any means necessary. The corporate chemists went to work, stripping away the expensive natural components that gave the syrup its distinctive crisp finish. In their place, they introduced cheaper, synthetic flavorings and heavier, highly processed acid sweetening agents, fundamentally altering the liquid's chemical makeup. It was a classic, devastating corporate maneuver. Hollow out the quality of the product to maximize the profit margin, banking on the arrogant assumption that the working-class consumer would be too unsophisticated to notice the difference. The board believed they were simply optimizing a recipe. In reality, they were tampering with perfection. But the disruption did not stop at the chemical level. Rheingold's leadership was equally determined to solve the problem of Grapette's unique physical presentation. For decades, the iconic, ribbed 6-ounce clear glass bottle had been the brand's most powerful marketing tool, designed specifically to deliver the soda ice-cold without ice, before it could lose its sharp carbonation. However, as the 1970s dawned, the beverage market was aggressively shifting toward large-volume, standardized 16-ounce glass and aluminum containers. To a massive conglomerate accustomed to shipping millions of barrels of beer across the Northeast, maintaining a specialized, low-volume glass bottle for a single regional soda was considered an absolute logistical nightmare. Without a single thought for the functional purpose of the smaller size, Rheingold unceremoniously scrapped the 6-ounce bottle. The newly altered synthetic syrup was abruptly pumped into massive standardized containers. The visual magic of the jewel-toned liquid shining through ribbed glass was completely lost, replaced by generic packaging that allowed the drink to blend seamlessly and fatally into the crowded background of the modern supermarket aisle. The final, most destructive phase of Rheingold's efficiency campaign targeted the human infrastructure of the brand. To streamline their newly acquired asset, the corporation aggressively dismantled the loyal, decades-old network of independent franchise bottlers that had built the Grapette empire from the ground up. These local operators, who understood their communities and had fiercely protected the brand's reputation for 30 years, were viewed by New York as an obsolete, inefficient middleman. Rheingold forced the manufacturing and distribution of Grapette into their own pre-existing massive industrial channels alongside their beer and other acquired soft drink brands. The localized care, the dedicated delivery routes, and the fierce independence of the Camden operation were entirely erased. Grapette was no longer a specialty item crafted by a dedicated community. It was just another flavor in a bloated, homogenized corporate portfolio. However, the board of directors had grossly underestimated the most powerful variable in commerce: the American consumer. Rheingold's executives believed that the brand's true value lived purely in the trademarked name and the familiar purple logo. They assumed that buyers would blindly consume whatever liquid was placed behind that label out of sheer brand habit. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. When the newly formulated, mass-packaged Grapette finally hit the grocery store shelves, the public reaction was not a loud, explosive boycott. It was something far more dangerous and irreversible to a commercial enterprise: a silent, immediate rejection. Consumers who had grown up with the sharp, crisp bite of the original 1939 recipe took one sip of the new concoction and instantly recognized the betrayal. The drink was now overwhelmingly sweet, heavily flat, and carried that exact dreaded medicinal aftertaste that Fuchs had worked so tirelessly to eliminate in his makeshift lab 30 years prior. Furthermore, the packaging change proved disastrous, just as Fuchs would have predicted. Poured into large, high-volume bottles, the soda inevitably went warm and syrupy long before the consumer could finish it, completely destroying the refreshing, concentrated experience that had defined the beverage for a generation. The magic was unequivocally gone. In the consumer goods industry, trust is a highly fragile, almost emotional commodity. Once a brand betrays the sensory memory of its core audience, that loyalty is virtually impossible to earn back. The families who had faithfully purchased Grapette for decades did not write angry letters to corporate headquarters. They simply stopped putting the bottles into their shopping carts. They quietly, permanently migrated to other brands that had not broken their promise of quality. Inside the Manhattan boardrooms, the sales figures, which Rheingold's analysts had confidently projected to climb through their optimized distribution channels, instead began a severe, terrifying freefall. The very efficiency measures designed to squeeze more profit out of the Arkansas company had effectively killed its soul. By severing the connection between the product's quality and the consumer's memory, corporate tampering had broken a profound cultural bond, accelerating the once mighty empire's descent toward a sudden and deeply tragic collapse. The transition of power from the humid, hands-on environment of Camden, Arkansas, to the sterile, high-altitude boardrooms of New York City triggered a rapid, systematic dismantling of everything that made Grapette a cultural institution. When the Rheingold Corporation took complete operational control in 1969, they did not see a beloved American beverage with a meticulously crafted legacy. They saw a regional asset laden with unacceptable manufacturing overhead. Armed with spreadsheets, quarterly profit targets, and ruthless efficiency mandates, the new executive leadership immediately targeted the very soul of the brand. The proprietary formula BT Fuchs had spent agonizing years perfecting. In the beverage industry, the line between a premium product and a generic commodity is defined entirely by the quality of its raw ingredients. Fuchs had always demanded the use of expensive, high-grade fruit oils and a tightly controlled balance of natural acids to ensure the sharp, authentic bite of real Concord grapes. To the corporate auditors at Rheingold, this uncompromising commitment to quality was viewed as a massive, unnecessary financial drain. The mandate from headquarters was clear and unforgiving. Lower the production costs immediately, by any means necessary. The corporate chemists went to work, stripping away the expensive natural components that gave the syrup its distinctive crisp finish. In their place, they introduced cheaper synthetic flavorings and heavier, highly processed sweetening agents, fundamentally altering the liquid's chemical makeup. It was a classic, devastating corporate maneuver. Hollow out the quality of the product to maximize the profit margin, banking on the arrogant assumption that the working-class consumer would be too unsophisticated to notice the difference. The board believed they were simply optimizing a recipe. In reality, they were tampering with perfection. But the disruption did not stop at the chemical level. Rheingold's leadership was equally determined to solve the problem of Grapette's unique physical presentation. For decades, the iconic, ribbed 6-ounce clear glass bottle had been the brand's most powerful marketing tool, designed specifically to deliver the soda ice-cold without ice before it could lose its sharp carbonation. However, as the 1970s dawned, the beverage market was aggressively shifting toward large-volume, standardized 16-ounce glass and aluminum containers. To a massive conglomerate accustomed to shipping millions of barrels of beer across the Northeast, maintaining a specialized low-volume glass bottle for a single regional soda was considered an absolute logistical nightmare. Without a single thought for the functional purpose of the smaller size, Rheingold unceremoniously scrapped the 6-ounce bottle. The newly altered synthetic syrup was abruptly pumped into massive standardized containers. The visual magic of the jewel-toned liquid shining through ribbed glass was completely lost, replaced by generic packaging that allowed the drink to blend seamlessly and fatally into the crowded background of the modern supermarket aisle. The final, most destructive phase of Rheingold's efficiency campaign targeted the human infrastructure of the brand. To streamline their newly acquired asset, the corporation aggressively dismantled the loyal, decades-old network of independent franchise bottlers that had built the Grapette empire from the ground up. These local operators, who understood their communities and had fiercely protected the brand's reputation for 30 years, were viewed by New York as an obsolete, inefficient middleman. Rheingold forced the manufacturing and distribution of Grapette into their own pre-existing massive industrial channels alongside their beer and other acquired soft drink brands. The localized care, the dedicated delivery routes, and the fierce independence of the Camden operation were entirely erased. Grapette was no longer a specialty item crafted by a dedicated community. It was just another flavor in a bloated, homogenized corporate portfolio. However, the board of directors had grossly underestimated the most powerful variable in commerce, the American consumer. Rheingold's executives believed that the brand's true value lived purely in the trademarked name and the familiar purple logo. They assumed that buyers would blindly consume whatever liquid was placed behind that label out of sheer brand habit. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. When the newly formulated, mass-packaged Grapette finally hit the grocery store shelves, the public reaction was not a loud, explosive boycott. It was something far more dangerous and irreversible to a commercial enterprise: a silent, immediate rejection. Consumers who had grown up with the sharp, crisp bite of the original 1939 recipe took one sip of the new concoction and instantly recognized the betrayal. The drink was now overwhelmingly sweet, heavily flat, and carried that exact dreaded, medicinal aftertaste that Fuchs had worked so tirelessly to eliminate in his makeshift lab 30 years prior. Furthermore, the packaging change proved disastrous, just as Fuchs would have predicted. Poured into large, high-volume bottles, the soda inevitably went warm and syrupy long before the consumer could finish it, completely destroying the refreshing, concentrated experience that had defined the beverage for a generation. The magic was unequivocally gone. In the consumer goods industry, trust is a highly fragile, almost emotional commodity. Once a brand betrays the sensory memory of its core audience, that loyalty is virtually impossible to earn back. The families who had faithfully purchased Grapette for decades did not write angry letters to corporate headquarters. They simply stopped putting the bottles into their shopping carts. They quietly, permanently migrated to other brands that had not broken their promise of quality. Inside the Manhattan boardrooms, the sales figures, which Rheingold's analysts had confidently projected to climb through their optimized distribution channels, instead began a severe, terrifying freefall. The very efficiency measures designed to squeeze more profit out of the Arkansas company had effectively killed its soul. By severing the connection between the product's quality and the consumer's memory, corporate tampering had broken a profound cultural bond, accelerating the once mighty empire's descent toward a sudden and deeply tragic collapse. By the mid-1970s, the disastrous consequences of corporate optimization were undeniable. The altered synthetic syrup and the generic large-volume packaging had successfully alienated the fiercely loyal customer base that BT Fuchs had spent 3 decades cultivating. For the executives at Rheingold, Grapette was no longer a promising acquisition or a crown jewel. It had become a toxic asset on their balance sheets. The massive conglomerate, entirely unwilling to admit fault or revert to the expensive 1939 formula, opted for the standard corporate exit strategy. They decided to cut their losses and sell it off. This initiated the most humiliating phase of Grapette's history. The once mighty American empire was reduced to a corporate hot potato, tossed haphazardly between various holding companies and rival beverage conglomerates. In a dizzying series of transactions, Rheingold eventually divested its soft drink division. The Grapette trademark was bundled with other struggling brands and acquired by entities who cared even less about its heritage than Rheingold had. Each subsequent owner looked at the plummeting sales figures and slashed the marketing budget further, attempting to extract whatever residual value remained in the fading name. The brand was systematically stripped of its dignity. It was no longer a standalone premium product demanding prominent display space. It was relegated to the bottom shelves of grocery stores, pushed into the dark corners of the beverage aisle where forgotten brands go to quietly expire. The vibrant, omnipresent advertising that had once plastered American highways with the confident slogan, "Thirsty or not," was completely abandoned. The neon signs in small-town diners burnt out and were never replaced. Grapette had become a ghost, haunting its own market, a product purchased only occasionally out of morbid curiosity or mistaken nostalgia, only to disappoint the buyer one final time. But the most profound tragedy was not unfolding on the corporate ledgers in New York or Chicago. It was happening on the ground in Camden, Arkansas. For decades, the rhythm of this Ouachita River Valley town had been synchronized with the mechanical clinking of the bottling lines. The massive steel vats of deep purple syrup had provided steady livelihoods for hundreds of local families. The constant arrival and departure of heavy distribution trucks had been the lifeblood of the local economy. Now an eerie, agonizing silence began to settle over the original production facilities. As the national demand evaporated, the corporate owners drastically scaled back the manufacturing orders. The sprawling, decentralized network of independent bottlers, already decimated by the cola wars, completely severed their remaining ties with the dying brand. there was no longer any financial incentive to allocate factory time or delivery space to a product that nobody wanted to buy. Inside the Camden plant, the inevitable machinery of industrial decay took over. The high-speed assembly lines were shut down one by one. The heavy wooden crates, once proudly stamped with the Grapette logo, were stacked in dark warehouses, gathering thick layers of dust. The workers who had dedicated their lives to mixing BT Fuchs's meticulous formula were handed their final paychecks and sent home. The air, which for 30 years had been sweet and heavy with the scent of concentrated Concord grapes, grew stale and metallic. The factory, once a beacon of regional pride and American ingenuity, was transformed into an echoing, hollow tomb. By the late 1970s, the execution was finalized. The last batches of the compromised syrup were run through the remaining indifferent bottling plants. When those final bottles were loaded onto trucks, there was no ceremony. There was no press release acknowledging the end of an era, and no public mourning for a billion-dollar empire. The distribution simply stopped. Across the United States, grocery store managers cleared the remaining plastic and large glass containers from their inventory, replacing them with the aggressive, bright packaging of the dominant cola empires. The physical erasure was absolute. A child born in America in 1980 would have absolutely no idea that Grapette had ever existed. They would never experience the sharp, ice-cold bite of the 6-ounce ribbed bottle. To a new generation, the Purple Ghost was merely a strange, fading memory that their parents or grandparents occasionally mentioned with a sigh of inexplicable loss. The total annihilation of a beloved cultural icon at the hands of corporate greed seemed entirely complete. Grapette was dead in the United States, murdered by the very systems that were supposed to elevate it. However, the corporate executives who carelessly signed the brand's death warrant had overlooked a critical, singular detail. When BT Fuchs sold his domestic empire in 1969, a small, seemingly insignificant clause had allowed his family to retain control of a distant, isolated fragment of the business. While the brand lay in ruins across North America, a solitary ember had been quietly smuggled out of the country, waiting in exile for a chance to survive. To the American consumer of the late 1970s, the death of Grapette was an absolute, undisputed fact. The brand had been scrubbed from the shelves, erased from the highway billboards, and quietly relegated to the dusty corners of cultural memory. The sprawling industrial network that BT Fuchs had built in Camden, Arkansas, had been utterly dismantled by the ruthless optimization strategies of the Rheingold Corporation and its subsequent buyers. In the United States, the Purple Empire was nothing more than a carbonated ghost. But industrial history is rarely a simple narrative of total extinction. Sometimes, survival depends entirely on invisible lines drawn on a map. To understand the miraculous survival of the brand, one must rewind to the fateful year of 1969, to the very moment the fatal contracts were signed with New York executives. While BT Fuchs was finalizing the sale of his domestic empire, a quiet, strategic maneuver was being executed in the background by his son-in-law, J. Paul Brooks. Brooks was an astute operator who understood the immense intrinsic value of the original product. He recognized that while the corporate giants were hyper-fixated on acquiring the massive, immediate cash flow of the American market, they were largely indifferent to the brand's unproven potential overseas. During the negotiations, Brooks successfully engineered a structural carve-out. He retained the absolute rights to the brand, the trademark, and most importantly, the original 1939 proprietary formula for all markets outside the borders of the United States. He formed a completely separate, independent entity known as Grapette International. When the ink dried on the Rheingold acquisition, the domestic company was effectively sentenced to death by corporate bureaucracy. But Grapette International was handed a passport. The contrast between the two diverging timelines is one of the most bitter, fascinating ironies in modern beverage history. Throughout the 1970s, while the New York boardrooms were busy aggressively stripping the quality from the American syrup, replacing expensive natural fruit oils with cheap, synthetic alternatives in a desperate bid to cut manufacturing costs, Brooks was quietly doing the exact opposite. Operating entirely outside the suffocating jurisdiction of American conglomerates, Brooks packed up the meticulous, uncompromising blueprints of his father-in-law's original formula and looked south. He targeted the emerging markets of Latin America, South America, and the Caribbean. These regions, with their consistently hot climates and rapidly growing consumer bases, were the perfect environment for a sharply carbonated, intensely flavored fruit soda that was designed to be consumed ice-cold. Without the massive overhead of a bloated corporate parent, Brooks was able to deploy the classic grassroots franchising strategy that had originally built the company in the 1940s. He partnered with independent regional bottlers in countries like Brazil, Peru, and Mexico. And most crucially, he absolutely refused to compromise the chemistry. The Grapette that flowed into glass bottles across Latin America was the exact high-grade, naturally accented liquid that had captivated the American South 30 years prior. The resulting business reality was a study in profound corporate irony. The very same 1939 formula that the highly educated, highly paid corporate auditors at Rheingold had confidently declared too expensive and inefficient to manufacture for the wealthiest consumer market on Earth was simultaneously being produced with massive, sustainable profitability in developing economic regions. While the American factories went dark and silent, international bottling plants were humming to life. While American consumers were rejecting the flat, synthetic, heavily syrupy version pushed by conglomerates, international consumers were discovering the crisp, refreshing bite of the authentic recipe. Grapette had not died. It had simply been forced into exile. This exile created a bizarre, decades-long psychological disconnect. For over 20 years, the brand lived a complete double life. In the United States, it was an artifact of nostalgia. Grandparents would occasionally reminisce about the vivid purple drink they used to pull from ice coolers at small-town gas stations, mourning it as a casualty of a bygone era. They assumed the secret recipe was lost to time, buried beneath the unstoppable march of the cola monopolies. They had absolutely no idea that just a few thousand miles away in another hemisphere, teenagers were actively pulling that exact same drink from modern refrigerators. The brand was thriving, untainted by the catastrophic corporate tampering that had destroyed its domestic reputation. For the people of Camden, Arkansas, the knowledge of this international success offered a strange, hollow comfort. It was proof that B.T. Fuchs's original vision was fundamentally sound, that the flavor profile was timeless, and that the product had only failed at home because of gross corporate mismanagement. The DNA of the brand was safe. The proprietary blend of acids, sugars, and extracts was locked away, actively preserved by the daily operations of Grapette International. The purple liquid survived the 1980s and 1990s as a thriving expatriate. It was a successful, sustainable business, but it remained entirely locked out of its own homeland. The trademark rights for the United States were still held hostage by a rotating cast of indifferent holding companies, rendering it legally impossible for Brooks to bring the authentic recipe back to American shelves. It seemed that the story would end there in a permanent, bittersweet stalemate. The brand would live forever in exile, and the American market would simply forget it ever existed. It would require a force of unimaginable economic gravity, backed by a deeply personal, almost irrational sense of nostalgia, to break the legal deadlock and drag the exiled ghost back home. Fortunately for the legacy of Grapette, a man possessing exactly that kind of gravity had never forgotten the taste of the 1939 formula. By the dawn of the new millennium, the commercial landscape of American retail had experienced a seismic shift. dominated entirely by an unstoppable force originating from the very heartland that Grapette once called home, Walmart, under the legendary and relentless vision of Sam Walton, had transformed from a regional chain of small-town discount stores into the most powerful retail titan on the planet. Yet, even as Walton's empire reshaped global commerce and swallowed up local markets across the American South, the billionaire founder carried a persistent, deeply personal nostalgia that no corporate spreadsheet could ever completely erase. Long before private jets, multi-billion-dollar quarterly revenues, and sprawling corporate headquarters in Bentonville, Arkansas, Sam Walton had been a young man growing up in a world defined by simple, tangible pleasures. Like millions of Americans who came of age during the 1940s and 1950s, Walton held a distinct, almost sacred space in his memory for the crisp, refreshing taste of a Grapette pulled straight from a water-chilled metal cooler at a roadside service station. It was the flavor of his youth, a sensory capsule of an era before hyper-consolidation, before massive suburban sprawl, and before the relentless homogenization of American consumer goods. As the decades passed and Walton watched countless regional brands vanish beneath the boots of massive conglomerates like Rheingold, he never forgot the sudden, tragic disappearance of his favorite beverage. For years, the memory of that specific jewel-toned purple bottle remained alive in his thoughts, a symbol of an authentic, small-town manufacturing heritage that the modern corporate world had carelessly discarded. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Walmart was no longer just a participant in the retail ecosystem. It was the absolute architect of consumer access. With thousands of massive supercenters spanning every corner of the United States, Walmart possessed a level of logistical leverage and market power that had never before existed in economic history. Sam Walton and the executive team carrying forward his foundational ethos recognized an incredible opportunity hidden within the vast waves of consumer nostalgia. Millions of aging Americans who had grown up in the mid-century were beginning to look back with a profound hunger for authenticity, seeking out the physical artifacts and tastes of their youth. Walmart's leadership began exploring the feasibility of resurrecting long-dead regional brands, utilizing their unmatched retail muscle to bypass the traditional, calcified distribution networks of the major soda monopolies. Naturally, at the very top of that wish list sat Grapette, the brand that had been murdered by corporate mismanagement in the 1970s, the ghost that had spent decades lingering only in foreign exile, was suddenly caught in the crosshairs of the world's most powerful retailer. But wanting to bring a dead brand back to life and actually achieving it were two entirely different operational challenges. The legal and technical hurdles standing in the way of Grapette's resurrection seemed almost insurmountable. The path toward the resurrection of Grapette required navigating a complex, decades-old web of fractured trademark ownership, corporate acquisitions, and bitter legal stalemates. For years, the rights to the United States trademark had bounced haphazardly between various holding companies, sitting dormant and neglected in corporate filing cabinets. Walmart's procurement and legal teams initiated a quiet, high-stakes campaign to hunt down the fragmented legal rights, cutting through layers of corporate bureaucracy to clear the path for a domestic return. At the same time, the corporate machinery reached out across international borders to the entity that had kept the flame alive for over 30 years, Grapette International, still guided by the descendants and associates of J. Paul Brooks. The reunion between the massive retail titan and the small, fiercely loyal keepers of B.T. Fuchs's original vision was a moment of profound industrial poetic justice. When Walmart representatives approached Grapette International, their mandate was surprisingly respectful of the brand's sacred history. They did not want to acquire the recipe merely to slap a legacy name onto a cheap, generic, mass-produced store brand soda. They wanted the real thing. They understood precisely what Sam Walton had remembered, that Grapette's enduring power did not live in the trademarked letters on the label, but in the precise, uncompromising chemistry of the 1939 formulation. Negotiations moved swiftly, fueled by a shared desire to correct a historic wrong. Grapette International agreed to partner with Walmart, supplying the exact proprietary blend of natural fruit extracts, acids, and secret flavor profiles that B.T. Fuchs had spent months agonizing over in his Camden, Arkansas laboratory. The synthetic shortcuts, the cheap sweeteners, and the cost-cutting measures introduced by Rheingold decades earlier were permanently locked out of the equation. For the first time in over 30 years, the authentic, original recipe was cleared to return to American soil. The logistical puzzle pieces fell rapidly into place. Walmart's vast distribution network, the very same infrastructure that had often crushed regional competitors, was now being leveraged to rescue one. The manufacturing lines were prepped, and plans were laid out to introduce the beverage exclusively across Walmart's massive nationwide footprint. For the aging residents of Camden, Arkansas, and for millions of consumers across the American South who had mourned the quiet death of the Purple Ghost, the news felt almost too good to be true. The empire built in a small lumber town was about to be given a second life, summoned back from exile not by a traditional beverage conglomerate, but by the retail titan born from the exact same regional soil. The stage was set for an unprecedented commercial resurrection, proving that while corporate greed can murder a product, a genuine, deeply felt human memory, backed by the immense gravity of a retail giant, can sometimes drag it back from the grave. The physical return of Grapette to American grocery store shelves in the early 2000s was nothing short of a commercial miracle, but its execution was built on absolute operational precision. When the first shipments of the resurrected beverage arrived at Walmart distribution centers, industry analysts watched closely, anticipating whether a long-dead brand from the 1930s could survive in the hyper-competitive, modern soft drink market. Skeptics had argued that nostalgia was a weak foundation for a consumer product, suggesting that generations raised on high-fructose corn syrup and aggressively marketed modern energy drinks would find a traditional, delicate fruit soda antiquated and unappealing. They fundamentally misunderstood the deep, emotional reservoir of consumer memory. The moment the familiar purple bottles were uncrated and placed onto store shelves, the response from the public bypassed mere curiosity and instantly ignited a wave of profound emotional connection. For millions of Americans who had grown up during the mid-century, encountering Grapette again was like running into a long-lost friend from childhood. Elder shoppers stopped in the aisles, staring at the distinct script logo and the brilliant purple liquid with a mixture of disbelief and quiet reverence. Many bought single bottles not just to drink, but to hold up to the fluorescent store lights, searching for the exact visual memory of the 6-ounce coolers of their youth. Word of mouth spread with astonishing velocity across local communities and internet message boards alike. Grandparents brought their grandchildren down the beverage aisle, carefully explaining how this specific drink tasted like summer afternoons, small-town main streets, and an era when things were made with uncompromising patience. It wasn't just a soft drink transaction anymore. It was an intergenerational transfer of memory. Families who hadn't spoken about the brand in 30 years were suddenly sharing stories across dinner tables about the local gas stations where they used to buy it for a nickel. Behind this overwhelming consumer reception lay the quiet, stubborn triumph of B.T. Fuchs's original vision. Because Walmart and Grapette International had adamantly refused to cut corners or cheapen the recipe, the liquid inside the bottle was completely authentic. It carried that exact crisp, sun-ripened Concord grape bite, completely devoid of the heavy, medicinal syrup flavor that corporate conglomerates had forced onto the product during its dark days under Rheingold. Shoppers took that first sip and experienced an instant, visceral sensory time travel. The taste hadn't changed. The promise had finally been kept. For Camden, Arkansas, the resurrection of Grapette served as a profound vindication. While the original factories did not miraculously reopen to employ thousands of workers as they once had, the town's historical legacy was firmly pulled out of the shadows of corporate failure. The narrative shifted from a tragic tale of a murdered empire to a legendary story of resilience. The Purple Ghost had successfully crossed back over the border from its foreign exile, proving that true quality and a founder's uncompromising dedication cannot be permanently erased by spreadsheets, hostile takeovers, or the cold machinery of corporate greed. The successful return of Grapette stands as a rare, shining exception in the brutal landscape of industrial history. Most abandoned factories, shuttered empires, and forgotten brands remain buried beneath the relentless progress of time, their stories reduced to rusted machinery and overgrown foundations. But Grapette demonstrated that when a product is built with genuine heart and an absolute refusal to compromise its core identity, its memory remains alive in the hearts of the people. And sometimes, if the nostalgia runs deep enough and the right retail titan is willing to listen, even a dead empire can find its way back home. By the early 2000s, the purple bottles finally returned to the American retail landscape, carried home not by corporate strategy, but by the weight of an enduring memory. The resurrection of Grapette proved a fundamental truth about industrial history. Supply chains can be dismantled, formulas altered, and factories silenced, but true cultural resonance cannot be easily erased by a balance sheet. A corporation can optimize every cost and standardize every container, yet it can never manufacture the deep, emotional connection forged between a product and the people who lived alongside it. Grapette survived its dark decades in exile because its foundation